Frank Harris. Perfect.
Here we are. Hello, everybody. I am sorry for the delay in joining. I had to reboot my computer and there was all kind of fun stuff happening here, but I am excited to be here. Thank you all for having me. And I am looking forward to the dialogue and conversation we'll have today.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to this. So I'll go ahead and introduce. My name is Anika Green. Welcome to Racelighting. It's a prevalent version of gaslighting facing people of color. My name is Anika Green. I'm Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of the Vice Provost for Graduate Education at Stanford. I'm also on the board for the American Council on Education, which is ACE, Women's Network. This is a Northern California focus group. And so we're happy that you have joined us all today. We're really looking forward to this session. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, and then one of our colleagues, our ACE colleagues, will moderate the Q&A at the end. Frank Harris is a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. In addition, he's a senior strategist in the Division of Campus Diversity and Student Affairs. He advises the division on efforts to institutionalize equity and designs innovative professional learning experiences to build equity mindedness among faculty and staff. Dr. Harris is an expert in student equity, institutional effectiveness, and student success. His work prioritizes those who have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. Dr. Harris earned a bachelor's degree in communication from Loyola Marymount, a master's in speech communication from Cal State Northridge, and a doctorate in higher education from the University of Southern California. I first learned about Racelighting when I read the article in Diverse Issues in Higher Ed that was co-authored by Dr. Harris and Dr. Luke Wood. And it resonated with me immediately. And I knew that it would also resonate with other people. So we're really happy to be able to offer this workshop today. I'm personally looking forward to learning from Dr. Harris. We realize that there's much that will come from this session and people will likely want to debrief some of the things that we're going to learn about. So next Friday, ACE is sponsoring just an informal debrief session next Friday from 12 to 1. Dr. Harris will not be able to join us, but members of the ACE board will be there and hope some of you will make it too. So we'll send information about that at the conclusion of this talk. We are recording it, and so we will send an email with the recording and information about the session next Friday to all of you. So without any further delay, please help me welcome Dr. Frank Harris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate the dialogue, and I appreciate this network that I know you all have created and worked hard to create. And I think spaces like this are incredibly important. And so when we get to sort of the institutional response to Racelighting part of the conversation, one of the things that we'll talk about is creating spaces and networks of support and networks that allow you to be healthy and whole and healing and kind of working through some of these challenges that we'll talk about with regard to Racelighting. And so I have a slide deck that I've prepared that I'm going to go ahead and share. I will say in advance that if anyone would like the complete slide deck afterwards, I'd be happy to share it. And so I'll make sure I send it along to Dr. Green. And so, as she shared in the introduction, I have the distinct pleasure of being a professor now for 15 years at San Diego State in the College of Education. My area of focus is post-secondary education. And I'm also involved in some other things, right, with regard to professional learning, and as well as directing a research and support lab, a research lab that focuses on equity in the community colleges. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is derived both from my personal lived experiences, but also these professional experiences that I've had, both in terms of being able to study issues of race and racial equity, but also in terms of, kind of experiencing a lot of the things and a lot of phenomenon that we'll talk about today. I also invite you, if you like to engage on social media, I use Twitter and Instagram. I'm not quite as proficient yet on TikTok and Snapchat and some of the newer platforms, but these are the two that I'm comfortable with. So feel free to connect with me that way as well. And so we're going to just dive right in here. The word race lighting, we've already used it a few times today. And I always think it's important to kind of define your terms. And so when we talk about race lighting, we're really describing a phenomenon that in many ways kind of operates like gaslighting, but in a more racialized context. And so the way that Luke and I describe it is the process whereby people of color question their own thoughts and actions due to systematically derived racialized messages that make them second guess their own lived experiences and realities with race, right? And so, I think a big part of this, or a big implication of this, is that we all have racialized experiences. We all experience racial microaggressions and other phenomenon as it relates to race. But where race lighting really sort of comes into play is the second guessing, or the questioning ourselves and questioning our worth and questioning our value and questioning if we actually experience what we know we know it, both sort of believe and feel the experience as it relates to racism. And as I'll kind of talk about as we unpack this phenomenon, race lighting has some negative consequences and implications, both, sort of for our personal selves in terms of health and wellness, but also professionally as well. And we'll talk about what those are. Some of the most common messages will relate to race lighting reinforces the assumption that Black and Indigenous people of color are lesser than or inferior, or those messages that criminalize us in one way or another. And so, when I think about my own experiences as a man of color, and more specifically as a Black man in the academy, I'm often, characterized or questioned as being aggressive or being angry and so forth. There's some pretty stereotypical characterizations that have been around for a long time as it relates to Black men. And I know my women of color colleagues, there are some longstanding stereotypes as well, right? So for Black women, it's also this, the sort of angry Black woman phenomenon, and the stereotype that is often levied as well, that really comes into play with regard to race lighting. And then also this whole idea of second guessing and questioning, the doubt and insecurity that derives from it really sits at the heart of this phenomenon. And so we also have to recognize that there are some very common examples of race lighting, some that we probably easily recognize, and maybe there are others here that we've experienced but haven't necessarily recognized them as race lighting messages. And so we have about a dozen examples here. We're obviously not going to talk about all of these, but there are three that I think that are incredibly salient for the conversation we're having today. As well as when we think about the larger political context in which we're operating, that really speaks to the heart of race lighting. So this first one here is accusing people of color of being overly sensitive when they call out racism, is one that we probably can relate to and have experienced in one way or another. This often occurs between colleagues, but also can happen to students when they experience racism. It's like, what you're saying and what you think your experience is really not what it was, right? You're just being overly sensitive. You need to be tougher. You need to, not be so focused on race. Be more focused on your work. Be more focused on your learning and so forth. This next one is also an interesting one, is when people of color are accused of furthering or exacerbating racial division when they call for racial equity, right? So we think about programs and services and opportunities that are intentionally created to support communities of color in academia, right? So we often hear on college campuses, but why do you need a program for Black students, right? Or why do you need an employee resource group for, Latino women, or whatever it may be? And, I think all of us in this space probably recognize and understand that, we need programs and we need safe and healing spaces like this to address centuries of systemic oppression that has continued to exacerbate racial inequity. And so that's often a big part of what we do. This last one is one that I always highlight when I talk about race lighting. And it's one that comes from a good friend and colleague, Dr. Sean Harper, who some of you may know as well. And Sean Harper talks about public declarations of incompetence when it comes to race. And this happens when we have someone that says, you shouldn't expect me to be able to work comfortably or to be able to engage people of color, or you shouldn't expect me to, to be, to have any competence as it relates to race. I don't identify as a person of color. I grew up in a town or a community that wasn't very diverse. So I'm not used to being around, working and operating in diverse spaces. Or, I've even heard someone say, well, I grew up in a family that was very explicitly and overtly racist. So because of all those things, you shouldn't expect me to have any competence, right? Or there shouldn't be any accountability for me in being able to really navigate and engage race in a healthy, positive, and productive way. That's a public declaration of incompetence. Now, what's interesting about public declarations of incompetence is that no one would ever say, well, I don't know how to balance a budget, so you shouldn't expect me to do that as an educational administrator. Or, I don't really know how to do a lesson plan, or, I don't know how to submit a human subjects application, right? No one would ever take any core part of their job or responsibility and publicly declare incompetence based on that. But people do this with race all the time, and they're very comfortable doing it with race. And so all of that, again, serves and often has a race lighting effect or a race lighting experience with that. When we think about the signs, like how do we know when we're experiencing race lighting, when we have these kind of exchanges and dialogues? When we start to second guess ourselves, right, is one example of that. Well, maybe I didn't experience what I thought, or maybe I am being overly sensitive, right? Or maybe I'm not as, good as I thought I was, or maybe my work is not as good as I thought it was. Or when we start to feel disoriented or hazy, right? When we can't quite make sense of what's going on in a particular space. Where are we residing? What are folks thinking and feeling about us? This feeling of unease and anxiety is another one. We're actually, one of the consequences of race lighting that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes is racial battle fatigue. And one of the telltale signs of racial battle fatigue is increased anxiety, not being able to concentrate and focus, feeling anxious as we enter certain spaces, or when we know we're going to be engaged with certain people, feeling as though you're under fire, right? So this whole feeling of hypervigilance, right? Feeling like someone is always, out to undermine you or even out to get you is another one. Being concerned that you can't get things right, that you can't quite figure things out, or feeling the need to avoid others, or even, a general sense of hopelessness. All of these in many ways reflect the cumulative effects that race lighting often have on us, both on our performance, but also on our psyche as well. And so, as academics, right, we often have to kind of take things and come up with some sort of figure or graphic. And so, of course, Luke and I did that with regard to race lighting. And what we do here is we try to describe the entire race lighting process. So we figured out, we spent some time talking about what race lighting is. We've defined it. We've talked about some of the effects of it, but it's also kind of important to understand the process by which race lighting often happens and often occurs. And I think the first thing we have to recognize and understand is that race lighting is triggered by, a set of antecedents, right? Things like white supremacy and white fragility and white nationalism, for example. And you see, you see definitions of them, of each of these phenomenon, right? But it's not just this, it's also things like anti-Blackness or anti-indigeneity or capitalistic interests as well. And so when we talk about anti-Blackness as an example, we describe it as having like this intense disdain for Black people, Black history, Black intellect, and any kind of progress for Black people, right? And we know anti-Blackness as an example, it's largely a U.S. phenomenon, but it doesn't, it's not just situated or it's not only just present in the United States, it's a global phenomenon. And what I often like to instruct folks is that you can consume Black culture, right? You can like Black food, Black music, and so forth, but that doesn't make you less susceptible or not susceptible to anti-Blackness, right? And because we know, for example, there have been many examples in which, Black genius, Black culture, Black intellect, Black talent has been kind of, leveraged and commodified and sort of taken out of Black communities, even when there's been a disdain for Black people and so forth. So returning to the figure, we have to recognize is that these antecedents often result in some sort of bias. There's a lot of conversations about implicit bias, or has been, for well over a decade now or so, maybe even longer. And we'll talk about that. But we also have to be mindful that a lot of the bias that we're seeing and experiencing is not just implicit. Some of it is very intentional and very explicit, right? And explicit bias being overt and intentional beliefs that negatively view, characterize, and engage others. And often these biases are self-reported as being consciously held by individuals. And so when we think about some of the rhetoric that we often hear on our campuses, or even some of the things, right? Some of the literature that's posted on our campuses, things related to white supremacy as examples, you see these examples here, all reflect explicit bias. And then, I also think it's important to recognize that implicit bias is also a phenomenon that can impact and be directly related to race lighting. And so these are three very, very different but related definitions of implicit bias. And I won't read them here, but I did want to highlight some cross-cutting themes that I think are important to recognize and acknowledge. The first is we have to recognize that implicit bias is reflected in our unconscious thoughts and assumptions that are often derived from past experiences. The second is that even though we're not usually aware of our implicit bias, it has some impact on our thoughts and actions, right? So, implicit bias is the bias that we don't often recognize, the bias that we're not conscious of, but it has some impact even though we're not aware of it and not conscious of it. And then lastly is that we're all susceptible to the effects of implicit bias. And so sort of taking that and recognizing both implicit and explicit bias can have some impact, that often leads to racial microaggressions. And those of you who studied or have had any type of work or engagement on the whole concept of racial microaggressions, you're probably quite familiar with the work of Dr. Daryl Wynn Sue. Let me take a step back. I'll say this. The concept of racial microaggressions was is actually credited to a scholar named Chester Pierce, who wrote about it in the 1970s. But Daryl Wynn Sue, who's been at the Columbia University for a long time, a teacher's college there, is probably the person who's made the concept more mainstream and who certainly has had the most research in this area. And so Sue and his colleagues describe racial microaggressions as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And there are a few implications of this definition that I want to highlight here. The first is that racial microaggressions are pervasive, right? So people of color, for example, experience racial microaggressions on an almost daily basis. We also know that they can be expressed both verbally and non-verbally. So it's not always about what someone says, but sometimes it's about their non-verbal behavior and communication, right? One of the examples that I often think about when I'm reading about, learning about, and talking about microaggressions, racial microaggressions, is how folks may perceive me, because of my race, but also because of how I show up physically as being dangerous, right? Or someone if they should be careful of or avoid, right? So when I think about the person who may clutch their purse if I'm walking by them at night, or someone if I'm walking on campus, say I'm leaving my office and I'm walking to my car, and I'm encountering someone as I'm walking towards them, that they may quickly turn the other direction or cross the street if there's an opportunity to do that, right? And so those aren't about things that people have communicated to me verbally, but their nonverbal communication and how they behave certainly, sort of speaks loud and clear about, how they view me and, what concerns they may have about me. The last one is that, because microaggressions tend to be expressed more subtly, So we don't always, right? There's this sort of stealth and underlying nature about them. It can often be difficult to kind of know where exactly the person is coming from when we're on the receiving end of a microaggression, right? And so, for example, if you have a professor who says, wow, student raises their hand in response to a question he asked, and the professor says, wow, that's a really good answer. I did not expect you to know that. That student may often wonder, well, why was this professor kind of surprised that I knew the answer? What does this professor think about me? Or, do they think I'm not smart, or do they think I'm not serious, and so forth? It's sort of the sense making that can come with that, not knowing exactly where they're coming from, can really be exhausting, and it could take up a lot of emotional and cognitive time and energy. And it's because of this that some scholars, I'm not necessarily advancing this perspective, but I do think it's important to recognize that some scholars say that racial microaggressions, as an example, can be as psychologically damaging, if not more psychologically damaging than overt acts of racism, because there isn't the second guessing and wondering and feeling what exactly is happening, where do I stand with that person with a more overt act, right? Whereas with microaggressions, it's because they're happening almost daily, the cumulative effect of them can make them more psychologically damaging. And again, I'm not necessarily advocating that, but I do think it's important to kind of acknowledge that that's where some folks are coming from in that regard. And then, kind of the last thing on microaggressions, that there are different types. They tend to fall into 3 different categories. There's 2 categories that you see here. The ones on the left are called micro-insults, and the ones that are highlighted in red tend to be the 3 most common racial microaggressions that are experienced by people of color in education, both educators and students, that consistently show up in the research. That's an description of intelligence, is when we ascribe a degree of intelligence to someone based on their race. An assumption of criminality is when we assume people of color, are thugs or deviants, or more likely to commit, acts of violence, or to cheat, or to try to steal, or get access to a resource that they're not deserving of. And the last one is pathologizing culture, when we assume that people of color are not value added to educational spaces. So those 3 are the 3 most common microaggressions, racial microaggressions, that are experienced by students and educators of color in the academy. And so again, right, there are 3 different types. Micro insults, which insult someone on the basis of their identity. The second is micro invalidations, which belittle or disregard someone's experiences. And then the last one, which you don't see here, is called micro assaults. And I don't usually talk a lot about micro assaults when I'm talking about microaggressions, because micro assaults are more consistent with overt acts of racism, right? They're not very subtle, they're very transparent. And so I often usually kind of focus more on micro insults and micro invalidations when I'm talking about racial microaggressions. And so that brings us, back to the process, and brings us kind of to the heart of the matter, and the phenomenon that we're really focused on here is the actual act of racelighting. And so again, right, I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about racelighting, again, it's not the actual message, it's the disorientation, it's the second guessing, it's the negative consequences that sort of result from that really makes racelighting what it is. So you can be microaggressed as an example. Someone may microaggress you, but if it doesn't have that sort of that second guessing and that disorienting effect, then I guess it wouldn't be considered racelighting in that regard. We have also found in our work that there are really kind of 2 main types of racelighting. So there's active racelighting, and then what we call passive racelighting. And active racelighting is when the person is intentionally trying to sow doubt or disorient the person who's on the receiving end. So I experience a racial microaggression as an example. I bring that to the person's attention, and that person actively, right, even though they know they microaggressed me, they know what I experienced was real, they say something or do something to make me doubt, or to make me question myself, or to disorient right, to make me sort of feel this sense of disorientation. is when it's intentional, it's much more active. There's also passive race lighting, which is not as intentional, but it still has the same effect, right? And so where we often see this show up, someone microaggresses or says something that's microaggressive, right? Wow, Frank, you seem really angry. Why are you being so angry and aggressive in our dialogue today? And when I point out to the person that they microaggress me, they tend to get defensive about it. Now they're not trying to sow doubt or disorientation or make me second guess what I experienced or what I felt, but it has the same effect of that, right? So when it's intentional, it's active. When it's not necessarily intentional but has the same effect, right? When it's done in a more defensive way, it's called passive race lighting. And then finally, sort of the bigger question is, okay, well, what happens when we experience race lighting, over a period of time? Well, we have found that there's sort of three big consequences of race lighting when we experience it on a regular basis. The one that you see here is racial battle fatigue. I'm actually going to come back to that one because that's the last one I'm going to talk about. But there's also a stereotype threat, which some of you may be quite familiar with. I know Dr. Green is at Stanford. So this work comes from two Stanford professors, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, who talks about the risk of confirming negative stereotypes about an individual's race, ethnicity, gender, or cultural group, to the point where it starts to affect their performance, right? So for example, if I know that there's a negative stereotype about me as an African-American student, that, the stereotype is that, people from my racial group don't do as well or don't perform as well on standardized tests, as an example. And I go into a standardized testing situation, right, where I have to take a test. And somehow I'm reminded, or somehow it's brought to my attention that, people of my racial group tend to not do well on this. Well, I can become so concerned about that and sort of bogged down by that. Or maybe focused on, proving that stereotype wrong, that it actually ultimately ends up having a negative effect on my performance, right? I end up not doing as well as I would have or could have if I hadn't been aware of or been thinking about that particular stereotype. So it's this whole idea of trying to prove the stereotype wrong or disprove it to the point where it starts to have a negative effect on our performance. The next one is imposter syndrome. And this phenomenon refers to what occurs when people of color believe they're not smart or capable despite having high levels of achievement and accomplishment that suggest otherwise. So when we experience imposter syndrome, we're likely to believe that we've somehow fooled someone or tricked everyone into believing that we're better, smarter, more capable than we truly are. And then there's always this fear of being outed, right? Or, this fear of being, seen or perceived as a fraud in many respects. And so that starts to have an impact on performance. And then the last one is racial battle fatigue. And this was a framework that was proposed by Dr. William Smith at the University of Utah. Some of you are probably familiar with Dr. Smith, just a wonderful colleague, and who's done some incredibly important work in kind of helping us recognize the cumulative effects of being immersed in chronically racist environments. And so what Smith argues is that racism is not something that happens ever so often. For people of color, it's a phenomenon that affects nearly every aspect of our lived experiences. Now, here's the sort of key point here, is that he links racial battle fatigue to a phenomenon known as combat stress syndrome. And combat stress syndrome is what soldiers experience in combat zones when the risk of being attacked is ever present, right? It's omnipresent. And so, what he says is that, as people of color in the academy, we often experience a phenomenon that mirrors combat stress syndrome, because we find ourselves immersed in these chronically racist environments where the risk of being, experiencing a racial microaggression, or the risk of, being race-lit or whatever it may be, or the risk of experiencing a more overt act of racism, being called the N-word or some racial slur, for example, is always present. And what he also says is this, is that it's not that this just happens, right? And we often think about these as, you just need to kind of get over it, right? It's just a part of being in the academy, right? It's a part of being an educator or, you know, student of color at a college or a university. And he says that the problem with that is that when you experience chronic racial battle fatigue, you actually, it could have a, you know, a physiological consequences, right? So you see some examples there, as well as psychological consequences. And you see some examples of, you know, some of the psychological consequences. The other thing he says is this, is that when, you know, you sort of say, okay, well, you know, maybe I need to go, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm having trouble sleeping, you know, or I'm feeling anxious, or whatever it may be. And you go and you decide, I need to go see I need to get some help for this. I need to go see a clinician or something like that. Someone that could, you know, help me make sense of what's going on and, you know, help me get some sort of relief from this. Is that most clinicians are not trained in racial battle fatigue, right? So often, you know, what you're experiencing is misdiagnosed as something else other than chronic racism, because most clinicians don't know anything about chronic racism and how it affects, you know, the lived experiences of people of color and so forth. And so, you know, when we talk about racial battle fatigue, it's not just about the phenomenon of racism, it's about the physiological and the psychological, the long-term physiological and psychological consequences of experiencing chronic racial battle fatigue. The last thing we'll say here is this, is that, okay, well, you know, what do we do about this? We know most institutions are not going to, you know, become less racist overnight just because we're aware of it or we're talking about it. You know, we as educators, those of us who experience racism, chronic racism, or those of us who kind of consider ourselves allies on this, we have to think about both campus responses, but also some personal responses. So when we think about campus responses, you know, we think spaces, you know, safe and healing and healthy spaces, it's what critical race theorists call sort of counter spaces, are very important. So having employee resource groups as an example is one way where we can, you know, not necessarily prevent it from happening, but kind of lessen the effects or consequences of it, as an example, right? Making sure that if we have any authority or we're in a position to advocate for assessment at our institutions, that we engage in campus climate assessments, that we advocate for campus climate assessments. But we're not just assessing the campus climate, we also need to make sure that we're accounting for the harm that comes from being in a racially hostile campus climate. There are a lot of places and a lot of institutions that do a climate survey as an example, and they'll find that, yeah, you know, our students of color, our educators of color are having bad experiences, right? But there's not an acknowledgement and an understanding of the harm, right? The personal harm that comes from these experiences. And, you know, as a result, if there's action that is taken or any sort of steps to mitigate things, is not done with the understanding of the harm that is happening. Professional learning, we have to make sure that our faculty and staff and even our students, that they understand, they have a better understanding of racism, Racelighting, racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, a lot of the things that we've already talked about today. This is particularly important for faculty and staff, right? Those who work at the institution, those who are paid by the institution. I know some institutions have more agency in being able to require these types of things, others less so. What I would say also is we need to think about what this means for hiring. And so part of what we need to do is when we're involved in hiring committees, whether it's faculty hiring or we're hiring administrators, that we're asking questions and we're getting some sense of, you know, where folks are in terms of the racial competence, right? Do they understand these things? Do they take them seriously? Do they have a proven track record of kind of helping to lead organizations in becoming less racist? As an example, these are the things that we have to start to kind of assess. If we're talking about faculty, do we have faculty that can talk about the importance of creating, you know, safe and racially inclusive spaces within the classes that they teach, as examples? These are all questions that we have to start asking. And then thinking about both group and individual counseling and therapy, is that a resource or something that a campus can provide, particularly when there are, when sort of these more blatant racist things occur on campuses, as an example. The last thing I'll say, and then we'll turn it over for Q&A and dialogue, is we also have to think about what's our personal response is going to be, both, particularly when it comes to being proactive. So if you're a person of color, right, in the academy, you kind of have a sense, and you can kind of anticipate that, you're going to experience some sort of racial, issues, interactions with colleagues and so forth. And so we have to be very, very intentional and very diligent when it comes to our self-care, right? So whatever it is we have to do to kind of protect ourselves, right, every day, whether, we need to wake up and, we need to meditate, or we need to pray, or we need to exercise, or, we need to do whatever we have to do to kind of make sure we're taking care of ourselves, taking care of eating right and things like that. It's not important to do just every now and then. We have to commit to doing it every single day. And part of why this is important is because oftentimes when we think about, for example, as people of color needing to prove ourselves, as an example, sort of outperform others, are going above and beyond what's probably reasonable in order to, not have our competence questioned, right, or not be challenged in terms of our work, but that could actually have negative health consequences for us. And so we have to be mindful to not do that, but also making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. We have to learn about these things, right? So I think conversations like this can be helpful in healing. I know when Dr. Green and I were planning, meeting to plan this discussion today, one of the things is that we talked about. So yeah, I've always felt these things, right? I've experienced race lighting, but I just didn't know that that's what it was, or that's what it's called. So being able to name something and knowing that what I'm experiencing is real, and it's not something that, it's a figment of my imagination, it's not something I'm making up, and it's not that I'm being overly sensitive, that can be empowering in many respects. Knowing where the places and spaces where race lighting occurs and transitioning to safer places and space, I'm going to kind of talk about those together, in the sense that we know, if we know that our academic department, right, if I'm a psychology professor, as an example, and I know that I'm in a department that's racist, right, and I'm constantly being racially microaggressed, then I got to kind of know that that's where it happens. And if I could avoid those spaces, then I do what I can to avoid those spaces. But I also have to make sure that I'm situating myself and putting myself and immersing myself in places that might be better, that might be safer, and that might feel more welcoming and more inclusive, right? As well. So if that means I'm doing more work with my colleagues in another department, as an example, if there's a Black Resource Center or cultural centers on campus, right? If there are other places where I can still do my work, right, or a place where I feel like it's safer and healthier and healing, then I need to spend more time there and less time. Now I understand that, it's not always easy to do that. There could be some expectations about us being present, physically present at times and in certain spaces, particularly if you're an administrator, right? You don't necessarily have the option to do that. But when you have the option to do that, and when you can do that, I encourage you to do it. And then this last one about documenting our experiences. I know some colleagues who are really into journaling and that sort of thing. And sometimes it can be helpful to kind of document and journal about what we're experiencing. Sometimes the whole act of being able to journal about it and to write about it, right? That could have, somewhat could kind of make things feel, not necessarily make it easier, but maybe it allows us to kind of compartmentalize it a little bit better at times. And so documenting our experiences when necessary, when that feels right and when we can do that is important as well. I want to conclude by sharing a few resources, and I'll make sure everybody has the slide deck for those who would like to refer to anything afterwards. But Luke and I wrote a couple articles that appeared in diverse issues. This one about how to respond to racial microaggressions. What I love about this article is that we present this process called the Raven. And essentially the Raven is a framework that we developed that can help us craft effective responses to racial microaggressions, not so much when we experience them, but when we observe them. And so take a look at that. This is the piece that Dr. Green mentioned earlier during the introduction, that where she became first introduced to the whole concept of race lighting. So, take a look at that one as well. And then we actually wrote a scholarly brief not long after the diverse issues piece came out, where we talk in detail about race lighting. We talk about some of the things that I presented today. We talk about the race lighting process. We provide case examples and narratives that really help to illuminate the concept. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 different ones that are about people of color who are operating and living in and being race lit in different spaces, academic spaces, corporate spaces, and so forth. I think there's another one where we talk about the experiences of a Black dad who is race lit at his kid's school. And so, how that plays out. And so I would take a look at that as well. And there's the link to that. We also have a YouTube channel where we've talked not just about race lighting. There's one, we did an hour-long webinar on race lighting about a year ago now. So you see that one here, but you can see there's a lot of other things that we've talked about. This is completely open access. And so when we talk about professional development, or if you want to share resources with colleagues, this would be a great one where they can just kind of look at these and get some information. It only costs them their time and don't have to travel anywhere. You don't have to bring anyone to speak. Just take a look at it. And so with that, I'm going to stop there. I think we have some time, about 15 minutes or so for dialogue. Thank you all so much again, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say and any questions you may have about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was incredibly validating for a lot of us, and it was also helpful to have some academic terms associated with the experiences that we know that we're going through. So thank you for this.
Thank you.
My colleague Rosalie is here, and so she's going to facilitate the Q&A. Rosalie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Harris. This was a very relevant presentation, so we want to thank you again for that. And also for the examples, because the examples brought the concept home. I know that I've been speaking with some students who were expressing microaggressions and they didn't know what it was until someone said in the meeting, that's a microaggression. And so that was this was very relevant, and I want to be able to take this recording to them and share that. But my first question, and I'll start to ask questions from the chat, is for our students who may be experiencing and don't know what it is, what are some of the resources? How can they approach faculty or someone when they realize what is happening? How can we support them, and what can we do to build a better community for the students?
Yeah, thank you, Rosalie. That's a good question. So that's that can be difficult, right? Because I often say you never want to encourage a student to challenge a faculty member, for example, if they don't feel like they're going to be supported, and if they don't feel safe to do so, if they're concerned about, retaliation or, things like that. And so for students, I often say, you got to identify someone, an advisor, another faculty member, maybe someone in another department who you can go to not only for counsel and advice, but also for advocacy and support. And so, it's really about getting somebody that can kind of help talk with the student about their options. Is this something that, we want to advocate and address with a department chair, as an example? Or is there a formal grievance process at the institution that can allow you to go through this with some protection and some rights as a student, for example? Sometimes students, they don't necessarily want to, go through a formal process, but they need somebody to listen to them. They need somebody to coach them through things. They need somebody to let them know that what they're experiencing is real and that they didn't do anything wrong, and what someone said or did wasn't appropriate. And so a lot of it is just, really start with kind of getting a sense of what is the outcome the student would like, and what would make them feel whole and make them feel, feel like they can kind of move forward in doing what it is that they need to do as students, and kind of guiding and advising them accordingly. But you know, we have to recognize this, and this is especially the case with students. A lot of our institutions have processes that are not about protecting students. They're really about protecting the institution and particularly protecting it from litigation. And so, you know, I think we have to be very thoughtful and we have to be very careful as we advise students, you know, through some of these things. And in some ways, we got to be honest with them and say, you know, you have this available to you, and I'm going to support you through this, and I'm going to do whatever it is you would like to do. But you also have to understand that, you know, these type of things don't often work out, and maybe a better way to approach this may be about not necessarily about that instructor, right? But also about, let's figure out some things that we can do to help you heal and to help you not, you know, make it less likely that you'll experience something like this again. It's something that I would, you know, talk with the student about.
Thank you very much. That's something I want to go back and share with our students as well as a resource for others. I do have a question in the chat. Do you have any recommendations for training for therapy on how to be a better support to clients of color?
Yeah, you know, I think, so there's a couple of things. First of all, I think we need to start encouraging our, you know, our students who have an interest in, you know, social work, or who have an interest in becoming MFTs, or, you know, working in the mental health profession, and not even just mental health, any of the health professions. Encouraging them to sort of, you know, go into those areas of study in a very race conscious way, right? So helping them saying, okay, yeah, you're going to go and, you know, you're going to have a clinical experience. Well, can you get a clinical experience that's going to really expose you to these concepts like racial battle fatigue, for example? Or can you get a placement that's going to help build your capacity to work well with communities of color, as an example? I think a lot of times, you know, our students don't even know, right? Students who are interested in those fields, they don't even know that these are options, right? They sort of just take and accept the curriculum that they have. I also think we need to be more intentional in hiring. So I know now we're at a time where colleges and universities can't really hire, they can't hire clinicians fast enough, right? And most of them are stretched to capacity or beyond capacity. But when there is an opportunity to make a hire, we need to, you know, create job descriptions that says, hey, you know, not only do we want someone who's going to be an excellent therapist or clinician and who's going to be interested in working in college and university settings, but we like someone who has a particular expertise, you know, around racial trauma, racial battle fatigue, and who actually, you know, has some training, some experience in engaging and dealing with issues of race, right? I think we need to sort of call those out and be more intentional in our recruitment of that. The other thing is that I think colleges have to do a better job of getting a better sense of what's available in their community outside of the campus context. And so if there are, you know, local community organizations, or, you know, maybe clinicians or therapy centers that aren't necessarily affiliated with the college, but that where students can be referred to, and even better, if they can use their university or campus health insurance to see those clinicians, I think that would be important things to do as well, as a starting point.
I love that you're talking about making sure people are putting in context and having an understanding of the words racial battle fatigue or Racelighting and those things. So are there any examples that we can point to of how Racelighting and racial battle fatigue have been documented to support tenure and promotion?
Sorry, I think it was the question is how does Racelighting and racial battle fatigue impact tenure and promotion? Was that the question?
Are there any examples that we can point to of how Racelighting and racial battle fatigue have been documented to support tenure and promotion? So if someone's going up for tenure promotion,
you know,
affected by this, are there examples?
I can't think of specific examples where it's been documented in a way that's kind of helped someone in their case for tenure and promotion. That being said, I think and we talk about this a lot in the research brief. What we know is that oftentimes for faculty of color, people leave before they even get to the point where they can even be considered for tenure or promotion. Sometimes it's so debilitating and so dehumanizing that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that race lighting and racial battle fatigue and racial microaggressions, they play a role in the high rates of attrition for faculty of color who even get the opportunity to take faculty jobs. This is especially the case if you're in, like many academic departments at a lot of institutions, you may be one of one or one of two, right? Or if you're, for example, if you're a woman of color or a Black woman in STEM, right? You may be the only one in your whole institution in that area. And so a lot of times folks end up leaving, not because they can't meet the expectations, but because the costs, right, and the personal costs and the consequences are so tough and so difficult that they have to leave. And so I think that's a big part of what we need to do. I have the pleasure of serving on the several tenure and promotion committees at my current institution. And I'm always mindful of that, right? When I'm reading someone's statement, it's not just about looking at the publications and their grants and things like that. That's important, but really kind of trying to understand their story and understand their journey and not being afraid to call these things out when we're having conversations about tenure and promotion, when we're reviewing the candidates' work and their dossier and so forth. And so I think that's, those of us who are in position to be able to do that, we have a responsibility to do that. But I also think a bigger concern is how do we elevate and make things more transparent and connect this to conversations about the attrition and even the hiring. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of conversation about, hey, we need to hire more faculty of color, but very few conversations about retention, and keeping them and making sure that they could have a successful career beyond hiring. There has to be some intentional things, intentional spaces that are created by institutions to make sure that that happens. You can't just hire someone and drop them in a department that's, that has very little diversity, or even some that have known to be racist for a long time, and expect someone to sort of not only thrive but survive in that situation. There's a greater responsibility that needs to happen afterwards for the college to make sure that person is having a successful experience. Happy to take maybe one more, Dr. Green, if there is.
There aren't any more questions in the chat, but I actually do have one.
Yep.
And this idea about imposter syndrome, and it's something that, we've been talking about, I've been hearing about for a very long time, and have gone to talks, have hosted talks for graduate students. But I'm thinking more and more about the institutional bias that impacts imposter syndrome. I'm reading more and more about that too. And rather than just taking it upon ourselves to think about it as an individual experience, but to really think about how institutions have been designed to exclude women and people of color. And so just calling out that explicitly, I think, is really important. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around that and how to start making that shift to include the institutional bias and the experiences of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Dr. Green. The fact of the matter is this, a lot of when we think about universities, and let's just think about universities in the United States, the vast majority, most of them were not designed and created for the existence and the education of women, people of color, people who may not have been, middle or upper class, right? And so a lot of what we're trying to do and a lot of the things that we talk about, we're trying to change and reform something that was not created to do what we're trying to get it to do. And sometimes we think that because, there's some small indicators of progress, that things are shifting for the better, right? And maybe they are, right? Maybe certainly, there's been incremental progress. No one could argue that. But some of these institutions have been around for literally over 100 years. And so I think sometimes we can be naive and frustrated in thinking that because now we have, a Black president, for example, or now we have an anti-racism statement, or now the word diversity is in our mission or value statement, that the institution is different. When in fact, at its core and the most fundamental level, it's still the same institution that was founded and created over 100 years ago, right? It's been that way for a long time. And if we need to think about our institutions as living organisms, that as we push and as we try to make it more racially inclusive and more anti-racist, it's going to push back to sustain itself and to be what it has always been and what it was designed and created to be, right? And so I think when we understand that an institution has an identity and an institution has all the things that we think about, so that people have, it doesn't necessarily make it easier, but we have a better understanding of and recognition of what we're up against. And it allows us to speak more thoughtfully about what needs to happen in order to address these longstanding concerns. But the conversation we're having today, it's these aren't necessarily new conversations, right? Maybe we have better language and more theories and so forth. But these institutions have been racially oppressive for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important point. We're at time. So thank you for that. And also for us to think about how we can practice radical self-care.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And using that self-care and joy as an act of resistance.
Yes. And spaces like this is an example, right?
Yeah.
This is an example of self-care, right? Creating counter spaces. And, my partner likes to ride the Peloton. She's on that thing all the time, right? And I don't mess with her because I know it's an important part of what she has to do, right? So whatever it is, we do it, and we're unapologetic about doing it. We don't feel bad about it.
Yeah.
We don't feel guilty about it. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been illuminating. Thank you for your time and being so generous with sharing information. Thank you to all of you for joining.